The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the courthouse as Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his worn suit jacket. His calloused hands, once steady enough to guard royalty, now trembled slightly as he clutched a folder containing what little evidence he had left to prove his innocence. The 38-year-old former palace guard had fallen from grace in the most spectacular way possible, and today would determine whether he spent the next 20 years behind bars or walked free. Just 6 months earlier, Marcus had been living a life most people could only dream of. As a senior guard at the Royal Palace of Valdoria, a small European kingdom nestled between France and Switzerland, he had dedicated 15 years of his life to protecting the royal family. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, and his reputation among his peers was that of a man who would rather die than betray his oath. The palace itself was a masterpiece of architecture, with its golden spires reaching toward the clouds and gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Marcus had walked those halls thousands of times, memorizing every painting, every tapestry, every secret passage that the centuries-old building held. He knew which floorboards creaked, which doors needed an extra push, and exactly how many steps it took to get from the main entrance to the royal chambers. His colleagues respected him not just for his dedication, but for his humble background. Unlike many of the other guards who came from military families or noble bloodlines, Marcus had grown up in the poor quarters of the capital city. His father had been a construction worker, his mother a seamstress, and they had saved every penny to give their son a chance at a better life. When Marcus passed the rigorous test to become a palace guard, his parents had cried tears of joy, knowing their sacrifices had paid off. The royal family had grown to trust Marcus completely. Queen Isabella often asked specifically for him to escort her during public appearances, and Prince Carlos would seek him out for informal conversations about life outside the palace walls. Marcus never forgot his place, but he had earned something precious in those marble halls. Respect and a sense of belonging he had never felt before. But on that fateful October morning, everything changed. Marcus arrived for his shift to find the palace in chaos. Royal guards were running in every direction. Servants were whispering in hushed tones, and the usually calm atmosphere had been replaced by an air of panic and suspicion. The crown jewels, kept in the most secure vault in the palace, had been stolen during the night. The theft was impossible, or so everyone thought. The vault required 3 different keys, held by 3 different officials, and could only be opened when all 3 were present. The security system was state-of-the-art, with cameras, motion sensors, and guards posted around the clock. Yet somehow, between midnight and 6 in the morning, someone had managed to bypass all these measures and make off with priceless artifacts that had been in the royal family for over 400 years. As the investigation began, Marcus felt confident that the real thief would be caught quickly. He had been on duty that night, patrolling the east wing of the palace, nowhere near the vault. His colleagues could vouch for him, the security cameras would show his movements, and his spotless record spoke for itself. He even volunteered to take a lie detector test, eager to help solve the crime that had shocked the entire kingdom. But when the lead investigator, Detective Ramirez, called him into the security office 3 days later, Marcus could see something had changed. The detective's face was grim, and spread across the table were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance footage. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that somehow, impossibly, he had become the prime suspect. The evidence presented to him seemed overwhelming, and yet completely fabricated. Security footage appeared to show him near the vault area at 3 in the morning, despite his clear memory of being on the opposite side of the palace. Bank records showed mysterious deposits into an account that bore his name, but which he had never opened. Most damning of all, one of the stolen artifacts, a small but priceless ruby ring, had been found hidden in his locker. Marcus protested his innocence with every fiber of his being, but he could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of his colleagues and superiors. Even some of the royal family members he had served faithfully began to look at him with suspicion. The local media picked up the story, painting him as a traitor who had betrayed the trust placed in him by the kingdom. Within a week, Marcus found himself arrested, charged with theft, conspiracy, and treason. His bail was set impossibly high, and he spent 2 months in jail before his family could scrape together enough money to secure his release. By then, he had lost his job, his reputation, and seemingly any chance of proving his innocence. The case against him appeared airtight, and his court-appointed lawyer seemed more interested in negotiating a plea deal than fighting the charges. As Marcus sat in that courthouse waiting for his trial to begin, he reflected on how quickly a life could be destroyed. He had always believed that truth and justice would prevail, but now he wasn't so sure. The evidence against him was circumstantial but convincing, and he had no way to prove that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to frame him. What Marcus didn't know was that his case had been assigned to Judge Elena Vasquez, a woman known throughout the legal system for her sharp mind, unwavering integrity, and refusal to be swayed by public opinion or political pressure. She had been presiding over cases for over 20 years and had seen every type of criminal and every kind of crime imaginable. As the bailiff called the court to order and Marcus stood to face his fate, he had no idea that the next few hours would change everything. The name Marcus Rodriguez was about to trigger a memory in Judge Vasquez that would turn this entire case upside down and reveal a truth that no one could have predicted. Judge Elena Vasquez entered the courtroom with her usual composed demeanor, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her place at the bench. At 55 years old, she had earned a reputation as one of the most fair and thorough judges in the kingdom. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her piercing brown eyes seemed to see through any deception or half-truth presented in her courtroom. The prosecutor, an ambitious young lawyer named David Torres, stood confidently at his table. He had spent weeks preparing this case, knowing that a conviction of such a high-profile defendant would significantly boost his career. The evidence seemed solid, the motive was clear, and public opinion was firmly against the accused. This should be an easy victory, he thought to himself. Across from him sat Marcus Rodriguez with his defense attorney, an overworked public defender named Maria Santos. She had been assigned to the case only 3 weeks earlier and had barely had time to review all the evidence. Looking at her client, she felt a deep sense of sympathy but little hope. The case against him seemed overwhelming, and she was already thinking about how to minimize his sentence rather than prove his innocence. As Judge Vasquez called the court to order, she looked down at the case file in front of her. The name Marcus Rodriguez was printed clearly on the cover, but something about it stirred a memory deep in her mind. She frowned slightly, trying to place where she might have encountered this name before. It wasn't unusual for her to see repeat offenders, but something told her this was different. Prosecutor Torres began his opening statement with confidence and flair. He painted a picture of Marcus as a man who had been trusted with protecting the most precious treasures of the kingdom, only to betray that trust for personal gain. He described how Marcus had used his intimate knowledge of the palace security systems to plan and execute the perfect crime. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Torres said, his voice carrying across the courtroom, "the evidence will show that the defendant, Marcus Rodriguez, deliberately and methodically planned the theft of priceless royal artifacts. He exploited his position, violated his oath, and stole treasures that belong not just to the royal family, but to the entire kingdom." Torres presented the security footage that appeared to show Marcus near the vault, the bank records showing mysterious deposits and the ruby ring found in his locker. Each piece of evidence seemed to build an unshakable case against the former palace guard. The jury listened intently, and Marcus could see the doubt in their eyes growing with each revelation. When it came time for the defense, Maria Santos did her best with what little she had to work with. She argued that the evidence was circumstantial, and that someone else could have planted the ring in Marcus's locker. She pointed out that the security footage was grainy, and that the person in the video could have been anyone of similar build and height, but even she seemed to lack conviction in her arguments. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Vasquez found herself studying Marcus's face. There was something familiar about him, something that nagged at the back of her mind. She had an excellent memory for faces and names, a skill that had served her well throughout her legal career. But this particular memory remained frustratingly elusive. As the first day of testimony concluded, Judge Vasquez retired to her chambers with a troubled mind. She prided herself on being impartial, but something about this case didn't feel right. The evidence was perhaps too perfect, too convenient. In her experience, real crimes were messy affairs with inconsistencies and loose ends. This case had been wrapped up with a neat bow, and that alone made her suspicious. That evening, Judge Vasquez sat in her study at home, surrounded by law books and case files. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important about Marcus Rodriguez. The name continued to echo in her mind, accompanied by a sense of familiarity that she couldn't explain. She decided to do something she rarely did: conduct her own informal research into the defendant's background. Using her access to court records and public databases, she began to piece together Marcus's life story. She learned about his humble beginnings, his exemplary service record at the palace, and the complete absence of any criminal history. As she dug deeper, she found testimonials from Marcus's colleagues praising his integrity and dedication. She read reports from his superiors noting his reliability and trustworthiness. She discovered that he had turned down several offers to work for private security firms that would have paid him much more than his palace salary, choosing instead to remain loyal to his position. The more she learned about Marcus Rodriguez, the less the charges against him made sense. This was not the profile of a man who would suddenly decide to throw away 15 years of exemplary service for a quick payday. Judge Vasquez had seen enough criminals to know that people rarely change their fundamental character overnight. As she sat back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes, a memory began to surface. It was from many years ago, when she was still a young prosecutor working her way up through the legal system. She had been assigned to a case involving a construction accident, and there had been a witness whose testimony had been crucial to the outcome. The witness had been a construction worker who had risked his own safety to help rescue trapped colleagues after a building collapse. His testimony had helped convict the contractor who had cut corners on safety measures, resulting in the accident. The man had been humble and soft-spoken, refusing any recognition for his heroic actions. Judge Vasquez's eyes widened as the memory became clearer. The witness's name had been Rodriguez, not Marcus, but someone with the same last name. She stood up quickly and went to her filing cabinet, searching through old case files until she found the one she was looking for. There it was, the case file from 15 years earlier. The witness had been Roberto Rodriguez, and as Judge Vasquez read through the testimony, she saw a note she had made at the time. Roberto had mentioned his son during his testimony, a son who had just passed the tests to become a palace guard. A son named Marcus. Judge Vasquez sat down heavily in her chair as the pieces began to fall into place. Marcus Rodriguez was the son of Roberto Rodriguez, the brave construction worker who had helped save lives and whose testimony had helped deliver justice in a case she had worked on years earlier. Roberto had been a man of unshakable integrity, and now his son stood accused of the very type of crime that went against everything his father had raised him to believe. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Vasquez allowed herself to consider the possibility that Marcus Rodriguez was not just innocent, but had been deliberately framed. If someone wanted to steal the crown jewels and needed a fall guy, Marcus would have been the perfect patsy. Someone with access to the palace but without the political connections to effectively fight back against false accusations. As she prepared for the next day of testimony, Judge Vasquez knew she would have to be very careful. She couldn't show favoritism or bias, but she could ensure that every piece of evidence was scrutinized thoroughly, and that the defense had every opportunity to present their case. Justice demanded nothing less, and the memory of Roberto Rodriguez's courage reminded her why she had become a judge in the first place. The second day of the trial began with Judge Vasquez calling both legal teams to her chambers for a private conference. Maria Santos, the defense attorney, looked surprised and slightly nervous as she entered the judge's office alongside Prosecutor Torres. It was unusual for a judge to request such a meeting so early in the proceedings. "I've been reviewing the evidence in this case," Judge Vasquez began, her tone measured and professional, "and I have some concerns about the thoroughness of the investigation. Ms. Santos, have you had adequate time to examine all the prosecution's evidence and conduct your own investigation?" Maria Santos shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The truth was that she had been overwhelmed with cases and had barely scratched the surface of Marcus's defense. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the main evidence, but given the timeline and resources available to the public defender's office..." Judge Vasquez nodded knowingly. She had seen this scenario countless times. Overworked public defenders forced to represent clients without adequate preparation time. "Mr. Torres, I'm granting a 3-day recess to allow the defense time to properly examine the evidence and prepare their case." Additionally, I'm ordering that the defense be given access to all palace security footage from the week before the theft, not just the night in question. Prosecutor Torres looked alarmed. Your Honor, we've already provided all relevant evidence. The additional footage would be a fishing expedition that could compromise ongoing palace security. Mr. Torres, Judge Vasquez interrupted firmly, the defendant has a right to a fair trial, which includes access to all potentially relevant evidence. If the palace has concerns about security, they can provide the footage in a secure viewing room. This court will not allow a conviction based on incomplete evidence. That evening, Judge Vasquez made a decision that went against her usual practice. She drove to the modest neighborhood where Marcus Rodriguez had grown up, hoping to find Roberto Rodriguez and confirm what she remembered about him. She told herself she was simply verifying information that was already part of the public record, but deep down she knew she was crossing a line that judges rarely crossed. She found Roberto's address in the phone book and knocked on the door of a small but well-maintained house. When an older man answered, she immediately recognized him despite the 15 years that had passed. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes held the same honest, determined look she remembered from the courtroom. Mr. Rodriguez? I'm Judge Elena Vasquez. I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes about your son, Marcus. Roberto's face fell at the mention of his son's name. He invited her in, and Judge Vasquez found herself in a modest living room filled with family photos. Many of them showed Marcus in his palace guard uniform, proud and dignified, with his arm around his father or embracing his elderly mother. Judge Vasquez, Roberto said slowly, I remember you. You were the prosecutor who helped get justice for my friends who died in that building collapse. You made sure that contractor paid for cutting corners on safety. Judge Vasquez nodded. Your testimony was crucial to that case, Mr. Rodriguez. You showed tremendous courage in coming forward. Roberto's eyes filled with tears. My son has that same courage, Judge. Marcus would never steal anything, especially not from the royal family. He loves serving them. It's been his dream since he was a boy. When I see him on television in handcuffs being called a traitor, he paused, collecting himself. Someone has done this to him, Judge. Someone with power and influence who knows Marcus can't fight back. As Judge Vasquez listened to Roberto speak about his son, she heard echoes of the same integrity and moral strength that had impressed her 15 years earlier. Roberto told her about Marcus's childhood, how he had always been honest to a fault, returning even small amounts of change when store clerks made mistakes. He described how Marcus had turned down lucrative job offers to stay loyal to his palace position, and how he sent money home every month to help care for his aging parents. There's something else, Judge Roberto said, reaching for a small wooden box on a shelf. Marcus gave this to me on the day he became a palace guard. He opened the box to reveal a simple medal, not valuable in monetary terms, but clearly precious to the family. He said it was to remind him of where he came from and who he was fighting to protect. He said as long as I kept this safe, he would never forget his promise to serve with honor. Judge Vasquez examined the medal and saw that it was engraved with the words, honor, duty, truth, the motto of the palace guards. The medal was worn smooth in places where Roberto had obviously handled it many times. And Judge Vasquez could see that this simple token meant everything to both father and son. When she returned home that evening, Judge Vasquez knew she had to be extremely careful about how she proceeded. She couldn't use information obtained outside the courtroom, but she could ensure that the trial was conducted with the utmost thoroughness and fairness. Her conversation with Roberto had convinced her that Marcus was likely innocent, but she would need evidence, not just instinct, to ensure justice was served. The next morning, she received a call from Maria Santos, who sounded excited for the first time since the trial began. Your Honor, we found something in the additional security footage you ordered. There are inconsistencies in the timestamps, and we've identified at least 3 other individuals who had access to the vault area during the relevant time period. We need more time to analyze this properly. Judge Vasquez felt a surge of satisfaction. How much time do you need, Counselor? At least a week, Your Honor. We want to bring in an independent expert to analyze the security footage and examine the electronic evidence. We also want to interview palace staff who weren't included in the original investigation. Judge Vasquez granted the additional time, despite vehement protests from the prosecutor. She could see that Torres was becoming increasingly nervous as his seemingly airtight case began to show cracks. She also noticed that several well-dressed individuals had begun appearing in the courtroom gallery, people who looked like government officials or palace representatives, all watching the proceedings with intense interest. That afternoon, Judge Vasquez received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. A tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit introduced himself as Lord Chancellor Williams, the highest-ranking official in the royal court below the royal family themselves. He requested a private meeting, claiming it was a matter of national security. "Judge Vasquez," he began in a smooth, cultured voice, "I understand you've granted the defense additional time and access to palace security systems. I want to assure you that the kingdom's investigation was thorough, and that Mr. Rodriguez is undoubtedly guilty of these crimes." Judge Vasquez studied the man carefully. Something about his manner set off alarm bells in her mind. "Lord Chancellor, are you suggesting that this court should not examine all available evidence?" "Not at all," he replied quickly. "I'm simply saying that prolonging this trial serves no one's interests. The evidence is clear. The defendant is guilty, and a quick resolution would be best for everyone involved, including Mr. Rodriguez himself." Judge Vasquez felt her anger rising. In her 20 years on the bench, she had occasionally received subtle pressure from powerful interests, but rarely had someone been so brazen about suggesting she should hurry to a predetermined conclusion. "Lord Chancellor," she said coldly, "this court will take whatever time is necessary to ensure that justice is served. If you have concerns about the proceedings, you're welcome to file appropriate motions through proper legal channels. This conversation is now over." As Lord Chancellor Williams left her chambers, Judge Vasquez realized that the stakes in this case were much higher than she had initially understood. Someone with significant power wanted Marcus Rodriguez convicted quickly and quietly, and they were willing to pressure a sitting judge to make it happen. This only strengthened her resolve to ensure that every piece of evidence was examined thoroughly, and that the truth, whatever it might be, would come to light. When the trial resumed after the extended recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed dramatically. Maria Santos, the defense attorney, walked in with a new sense of purpose and confidence, carrying several boxes of documents and accompanied by 2 expert witnesses she had managed to secure with the help of a pro bono legal organization that had taken interest in the case. Judge Vasquez noticed immediately that Lord Chancellor Williams was present in the gallery, along with several other palace officials she didn't recognize. Their presence felt intimidating, and she could see that Marcus Rodriguez looked nervous. As he glanced back at the powerful men watching his trial, Maria Santos began by calling Dr. Jennifer Park, a digital forensics expert, to testify about the security footage. Dr. Park had spent the past week analyzing every frame of video from the palace cameras, and her findings were startling. "Your Honor," Dr. Park began, "I've discovered significant anomalies in the security footage provided as evidence. The metadata shows that several files were edited after the original recording date. Specifically, the footage showing the defendant near the vault area contains digital artifacts consistent with sophisticated video manipulation." Prosecutor Torres jumped to his feet. "Objection. This witness is making speculative claims about evidence that has already been authenticated by palace security experts." Judge Vasquez overruled the objection and allowed Dr. Park to continue. The expert went on to explain that modern video editing software could create seamless forgeries that would fool casual observation, but leave digital fingerprints detectable by advanced analysis techniques. "In simple terms," Dr. Park said, addressing the jury directly, "someone took genuine footage of Mr. Rodriguez from other parts of the palace and digitally inserted him into scenes near the vault. The person who did this was skilled, but they couldn't completely hide the evidence of manipulation." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Judge Vasquez could see shock and confusion on the faces of the jury members. Marcus Rodriguez looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to frame him. Maria Santos then called her second expert witness, a banking specialist named Robert Chen, who had analyzed the mysterious bank account that supposedly belonged to Marcus. Chen's testimony was equally damaging to the prosecution's case. The account in question was opened using identity documents that appear to be forgeries, Chen explained. While the name and social security number matched the defendant, the signature on the account opening documents is inconsistent with genuine samples of Mr. Rodriguez's handwriting, Additionally, the deposits were made through a sophisticated money laundering scheme involving multiple offshore accounts. Judge Vasquez watched as Prosecutor Torres grew visibly uncomfortable. She could see him shuffling through his notes frantically, clearly unprepared for this level of scrutiny of what he had assumed was solid evidence. The defense then called several palace staff members who had not been interviewed during the original investigation. These witnesses painted a picture of Marcus as a dedicated, honest employee who had gone out of his way to help colleagues and had never shown any signs of financial distress or criminal inclination. One particularly compelling witness was Elena Martinez, a senior palace administrator who had worked closely with the security staff for over 20 years. She testified that Marcus had actually reported several security vulnerabilities to his superiors in the months before the theft, suggesting improvements that could have prevented the crime. Mr. Rodriguez was concerned about outdated security protocols, Martinez explained. He submitted several written reports recommending upgrades to the vault security system. He seemed genuinely worried that the current measures weren't adequate to protect the crown jewels. This testimony was particularly significant because it suggested that Marcus not only had no motive to steal the jewels, but had actually been trying to prevent such a theft from occurring. As the day progressed, Judge Vasquez noticed that Lord Chancellor Williams and his associates were having hushed conversations during breaks, and their expressions grew increasingly grave. She also observed that some of the palace staff witnesses seemed nervous, occasionally glancing at the officials in the gallery before answering questions. During the lunch recess, Judge Vasquez was approached by Detective Ramirez, the lead investigator who had built the case against Marcus. To her surprise, he asked to speak with her privately. "Judge Vasquez," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something off the record. I've been a detective for 20 years, and I've never felt good about this case. The evidence appeared too quickly, too conveniently. When I tried to dig deeper into some of the leads, I was told by my superiors to focus only on building the case against Rodriguez." Judge Vasquez listened carefully, knowing that what the detective was telling her couldn't be used in court but might provide important context for understanding what was really happening. "I've been doing some investigating on my own time," Detective Ramirez continued. "There are inconsistencies in the official reports that were never followed up, witnesses who weren't interviewed, security logs that went missing. Someone with authority over this investigation wanted it to lead to Marcus Rodriguez and nowhere else." That afternoon, the defense called Marcus Rodriguez himself to testify. Judge Vasquez had seen many defendants take the stand over the years, and she had developed a good sense for when someone was lying. As Marcus spoke about his love for his job, his respect for the royal family, and his complete bewilderment at finding himself accused of such crimes, she heard the ring of truth in every word. Marcus described his movements on the night of the theft in detail, explaining his patrol route and the colleagues he had encountered. He spoke about finding the ruby ring in his locker and his immediate assumption that someone had accidentally dropped it there. He had planned to turn it in to Lost and Found before he was arrested. "I know how this looks," Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the emotion in his eyes. "I know the evidence seems to point to me. But I swear on my father's honor, I did not steal those jewels. I would never betray the trust that the royal family placed in me. Someone has gone to great lengths to make me look guilty, and I don't understand why." During cross-examination, Prosecutor Torres tried to break down Marcus's story, but the defendant remained consistent and credible. Torres pointed out that Marcus had no alibi for certain periods during his patrol. But Marcus explained that solo patrols naturally included times when he wasn't in sight of cameras or colleagues. As the day ended, Judge Vasquez could see that the jury's attitude toward Marcus had shifted significantly. The evidence that had seemed so damning at the beginning of the trial now appeared highly suspect, and Marcus himself had come across as honest and sympathetic. That evening, Judge Vasquez received a phone call at home from an unknown number. When she answered, a distorted voice warned her that some cases are better left closed, and that judges who ask too many questions sometimes find their careers cut short. The caller hung up before she could respond. Rather than intimidating her, the threatening call only strengthened Judge Vasquez's resolve. In her experience, innocent people didn't make threatening phone calls to judges. Someone was very worried about what this trial might reveal, and they were willing to go to dangerous lengths to stop the truth from coming out. As she prepared for what would likely be the final day of testimony, Judge Vasquez knew that she was dealing with more than just a simple theft case. This was about corruption, abuse of power, and the willingness of some people to destroy an innocent man's life to cover their own crimes. She was determined to ensure that justice would prevail, no matter how powerful the forces aligned against it. The final day of testimony began with an unexpected development that would change everything. As Judge Vasquez entered her chambers that morning, she found her bailiff waiting with a nervous-looking young woman who introduced herself as Carmen Silva, a palace cleaning staff member. "Your Honor," Carmen said, her hands shaking as she spoke, "I have information about the night the crown jewels were stolen. I've been too scared to come forward, but after watching the trial on television, I can't stay silent anymore." Judge Vasquez immediately called both legal teams to her chambers and had Carmen's testimony recorded. What the young woman revealed sent shockwaves through everyone present. Carmen explained that she had been working late that night, cleaning the administrative offices near the vault area. Around 2 a.m, she had seen Lord Chancellor Williams himself in the secured corridor, something that struck her as odd since he never worked such late hours. He was accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize, both carrying what appeared to be equipment cases. "I hid because I was afraid I would get in trouble for being in that area so late," Carmen testified. "But I watched them through a crack in the door. Lord Williams used his master key to access the vault corridor, and the other men set up some kind of electronic equipment. They were there for about an hour." Maria Santos, the defense attorney, could barely contain her excitement. This testimony directly contradicted the prosecution's timeline and provided a completely different explanation for how the theft had occurred. Carmen continued her account, explaining that she had seen the same 2 unknown men leaving the palace through a service entrance around 4 a.m, now carrying heavy bags that seemed to weigh them down significantly. Lord Chancellor Williams had left separately through the main entrance about 30 minutes later. "I thought about reporting what I saw," Carmen said, "but Lord Williams is one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Who would believe a cleaning lady over someone like him? And then when I heard that Marcus Rodriguez had been arrested, I was confused because I knew he wasn't anywhere near the vault that night." Judge Vasquez asked Carmen why she had decided to come forward now, despite her fears. "Because Mr. Rodriguez has a family, just like I do," Carmen replied, tears in her eyes. "His father comes to the market where my mother shops, and she tells me how heartbroken he is. I have children too, and I can't let an innocent man go to prison when I know he didn't do this." After Carmen's testimony was recorded, Judge Vasquez faced a critical decision. This new evidence potentially implicated one of the most powerful officials in the kingdom, but it came very late in the trial. She decided to allow Carmen to testify in open court, despite vehement objections from the prosecutor. When court reconvened, the gallery was packed with reporters and curious spectators who had heard rumors that explosive new evidence was about to be presented. Lord Chancellor Williams was notably absent, having left the courthouse during the morning recess. Carmen took the stand and repeated her testimony for the jury. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Several jury members looked shocked, and one woman gasped audibly when Carmen described seeing Lord Chancellor Williams in the vault corridor in the middle of the night. Prosecutor Torres attempted to discredit Carmen's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that she was confused about dates and times, or that she might have been paid by the defense to lie, but Carmen remained steady and consistent in her account, and her obvious nervousness actually made her more credible rather than less. "Miss Silva," Torres asked, "why should this jury believe that you're telling the truth when you waited until the very end of this trial to come forward?" Carmen looked directly at the jury as she answered, "Because I was scared, sir. Lord Chancellor Williams has the power to have me fired or worse. But watching Mr. Rodriguez's father cry on television, knowing that an innocent man might go to prison, I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet." Following Carmen's testimony, Maria Santos requested an immediate recess to file for additional discovery, including Lord Chancellor Williams' keycard access records for the night of the theft and any security footage showing his movements in the palace. Judge Vasquez granted the request over the prosecution's strong objections. During the recess, Detective Ramirez approached Judge Vasquez again, this time requesting to speak on the record. He revealed that he had been conducting his own investigation into the inconsistencies he had noticed in the original case. Your Honor, I've discovered that Lord Chancellor Williams had significant gambling debts that became critical around the time of the theft. I also found evidence that the two unknown men Miss Silva described are known associates of an international art theft ring. This information was in my preliminary reports, but I was ordered to exclude it from the final investigation. Judge Vasquez realized that she was dealing with a conspiracy that went much deeper than a simple theft. It appeared that Lord Chancellor Williams had orchestrated the theft of the crown jewels to pay his gambling debts, then used his position and influence to frame Marcus Rodriguez for the crime. That afternoon, Judge Vasquez took the unusual step of issuing a judicial order, requiring Lord Chancellor Williams to appear in court to answer questions about his whereabouts on the night of the theft. Within hours, she received word that Williams had fled the country on a private jet, heading to a nation that had no extradition treaty with their kingdom. The news of Williams's flight spread quickly through the courthouse and then to the media. By evening, it was the lead story on every news program in the kingdom. The man who had been one of the most trusted officials in the royal court had abandoned his position and fled rather than face questions about his involvement in the theft of the crown jewels. As Judge Vasquez prepared for what would likely be the final day of the trial, she reflected on how close the justice system had come to failing Marcus Rodriguez. If Carmen Silva hadn't found the courage to come forward, if the defense hadn't been given additional time to examine the evidence, if she herself hadn't insisted on a thorough examination of all the facts, an innocent man would have gone to prison for 20 years. The next morning, Prosecutor Torres stood before the jury with a defeated expression and announced that in light of the new evidence, the state was dropping all charges against Marcus Rodriguez. The courtroom erupted in cheers and Judge Vasquez had to call for order several times. But Judge Vasquez wasn't finished yet. She had one more crucial moment planned, something that would provide closure not just for this case, but for a connection that had been made 15 years earlier in her courtroom. As Marcus Rodriguez stood to hear the formal dismissal of charges, Judge Vasquez asked him to remain standing for a moment longer. She then did something unprecedented in her judicial career. She stood up from her bench and addressed him directly. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom, "before this court dismisses these charges, I want to say something personal. 15 years ago, your father Roberto Rodriguez appeared in my courtroom as a witness in another case. His courage and integrity in that case helped ensure that justice was served, and those qualities clearly live on in his son." Marcus looked stunned, and Judge Vasquez could see tears forming in his eyes as he realized the significance of what she was saying. "Your father's testimony helped convict a contractor who had caused the deaths of several workers through negligence and corner cutting. Roberto Rodriguez risked his own safety to help rescue his fellow workers, and then he risked his job to testify truthfully about what happened. Today, his son has shown that same courage and integrity in the face of false accusations and a conspiracy designed to destroy his life." Judge Vasquez paused, looking directly at Marcus. "The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You are free to go, and this court owes you an apology for the injustice you have suffered." As the gavel came down for the final time, the courtroom erupted in celebration. Marcus Rodriguez was finally free, his name cleared, and the truth had prevailed against seemingly impossible odds. The moments following Judge Vasquez's dismissal of charges were unlike anything the courthouse had ever witnessed. Marcus Rodriguez stood frozen in disbelief as the reality of his freedom slowly sank in. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension and uncertainty for weeks, suddenly erupted into a celebration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Maria Santos, his defense attorney, was the first to reach him, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her client. "We did it, Marcus," she whispered. "You're free. You're actually free." From the gallery, Marcus heard a voice that made his heart soar, his father Roberto calling his name. The older man pushed through the crowd, his weathered face shining with joy and relief. When father and son embraced in the middle of the courtroom, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Roberto held his son tightly, whispering prayers of gratitude in Spanish while Marcus finally allowed himself to break down and cry. Judge Vasquez watched the reunion from her bench, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that justice had finally been served. But she also knew that the work was far from over. Lord Chancellor Williams was still at large. The stolen crown jewels had not been recovered, and there would need to be a thorough investigation into how the justice system had come so close to convicting an innocent man. Within hours of Marcus's exoneration, the royal family issued an unprecedented public statement. Queen Isabella herself appeared on television to formally apologize to Marcus Rodriguez and his family for the ordeal they had endured. She announced that Marcus would be reinstated to his position as a palace guard with full back pay and a promotion to senior security coordinator, a newly created position that would put him in charge of updating and modernizing the palace security systems. Mr. Rodriguez has shown that his loyalty to the crown and his integrity are unshakable, even in the face of false accusations and public humiliation, the Queen said in her televised address. He will play a crucial role in ensuring that such a security breach never happens again, and his recommendations for improvements will be implemented immediately. The media coverage of Marcus's exoneration was extensive, but it was the human interest stories that really captured the public's imagination. Reporters discovered that during his months of legal troubles, when Marcus was unable to work and his family was struggling financially, dozens of his former colleagues and community members had quietly contributed money to help pay for his legal expenses and support his family. Carmen Silva, the brave cleaning woman whose testimony had been crucial to exposing the truth, became something of a folk hero. The royal family honored her with a medal for courage and promoted her to a supervisory position in the palace housekeeping staff. A scholarship fund was established in her name to help the children of palace workers attend university. Detective Ramirez, who had risked his career to investigate the inconsistencies in the case, was promoted to chief detective and put in charge of a new unit focused on investigating corruption within government institutions. His first assignment was to track down Lord Chancellor Williams and recover the stolen crown jewels. Meanwhile, the investigation into Williams's crimes revealed the true scope of his corruption. Financial records showed that he had been embezzling money from various royal accounts for years to feed a gambling addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. The theft of the crown jewels had been his desperate attempt to pay off massive debts to dangerous criminal organizations. The two men who had helped Williams steal the jewels were eventually tracked down through international law enforcement cooperation. One of them, facing the prospect of life in prison, agreed to cooperate with authorities and revealed that Williams had promised them they would never be caught because he had already selected the perfect scapegoat, a loyal palace guard with no political connections who wouldn't be able to fight back. Effectively, the recovered crown jewels were found in a safety deposit box in Switzerland, where Williams had hidden them while negotiating their sale to private collectors. The artifacts were returned to the palace in a ceremony attended by Marcus Rodriguez, who was given the honor of personally ensuring their security during transport. As the weeks passed, Marcus gradually returned to his normal life, but the experience had changed him profoundly. He found himself more aware of the fragility of justice and the importance of having people willing to stand up for the truth. He began volunteering with legal aid organizations, helping other people who had been wrongfully accused of crimes. Judge Vasquez also found herself reflecting on the case and what it had taught her about the justice system. She realized that if she hadn't taken the time to thoroughly examine the evidence, if she hadn't remembered Roberto Rodriguez from 15 years earlier, if Carmen Silva hadn't found the courage to come forward, an innocent man would have spent decades in prison. The connection between Judge Vasquez and the Rodriguez family deepened over time. She began attending family gatherings and holiday celebrations, having been essentially adopted as an honorary member of their extended family. Roberto Rodriguez would often tell the story of how Judge Vasquez had helped ensure justice in 2 different cases involving his family, 15 years apart. The case also led to significant reforms in the kingdom's justice system. New protocols were established to ensure that defense attorneys had adequate time and resources to examine evidence thoroughly. Independent oversight committees were created to investigate cases where there might be conflicts of interest or political pressure. The palace security system was completely overhauled, with Marcus Rodriguez leading the effort to implement modern safeguards and protocols. Perhaps most importantly, The case became a landmark example of how the justice system was supposed to work. Law schools throughout the kingdom began using it as a case study in the importance of thorough investigation, the dangers of rushing to judgment, and the crucial role that ordinary citizens like Carmen Silva could play in ensuring that truth prevailed over power and influence. Lord Chancellor Williams was eventually extradited back to the kingdom after being captured in a casino in Monaco. Still trying to gamble his way out of his problems, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for theft, conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of office. During his sentencing hearing, he finally confessed to framing Marcus Rodriguez, expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse for the pain he had caused an innocent family. As Marcus Rodriguez stood in the palace courtyard on the first anniversary of his exoneration, wearing his palace guard uniform once again, and overseeing the security preparations for a state dinner, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the judge who had refused to be pressured into a quick conviction, the defense attorney who had fought tirelessly despite overwhelming odds, the cleaning woman who had risked everything to tell the truth, and, most of all, his father, whose example of integrity and courage had sustained him through the darkest period of his life. The experience had taught him that justice was not guaranteed, that it required constant vigilance and the courage of ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. But it had also shown him that truth had a power all its own, and that even the most elaborate conspiracies could not ultimately prevail against people determined to do what was right. 5 years after his exoneration, Marcus Rodriguez had become one of the most respected security professionals in the kingdom. His new position as director of palace security had evolved far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned, and his reputation for integrity and innovation had spread throughout Europe's royal circles. The security system he had designed and implemented at the palace was now considered a model for other royal residences and high-security facilities around the world. Marcus had insisted on a philosophy of transparency and accountability that was revolutionary in the traditionally secretive world of palace security. Every security officer now underwent extensive background checks conducted by independent agencies, and there were multiple layers of oversight to prevent any single individual from having too much access or power. Judge Vasquez had retired from the bench 2 years earlier, but she remained active in legal education and reform efforts. She frequently spoke at law schools and judicial conferences about the Rodriguez case, emphasizing the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of allowing political pressure to influence judicial decisions. She had written a book about the case, titled When Justice Hangs in the Balance, which had become required reading in many law schools. The friendship between Judge Vasquez and the Rodriguez family had only deepened over the years. She had officiated at Marcus's wedding to Isabella Santos, a teacher he had met at a community event for crime victims. The ceremony had been held in the small church where Marcus had been baptized, and the guest list had included everyone from palace royalty to Carmen Silva and her family. Roberto Rodriguez, now in his 70s, had become something of a celebrity in his own right. He frequently spoke at community events about the importance of courage and integrity, often telling the story of how his son's case had shown that ordinary people could make a difference in the fight for justice. Despite his age, he continued to work part-time in construction, saying that honest work kept him grounded and reminded him of where his family had come from. Carmen Silva had used her newfound prominence to become an advocate for workers' rights and had eventually been elected to the local city council. She sponsored legislation requiring that all public buildings have anonymous tip lines for reporting corruption or safety violations, and she had helped establish legal aid funds for working-class families who couldn't afford adequate legal representation. The case had also had far-reaching effects on the kingdom's political system. The revelation that Lord Chancellor Williams had been able to operate with impunity for years had led to comprehensive reforms in how high-ranking officials were monitored and held accountable. New laws required financial disclosure statements, regular audits, and independent oversight committees for all senior government positions. Marcus and Isabella Rodriguez now had 2 young children, and Marcus often told them bedtime stories about the importance of always telling the truth, even when it was difficult or scary. He wanted them to understand that their grandfather Roberto and their honorary grandmother Elena Vasquez were heroes not because they had special powers, but because they had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. The crown jewels that had been at the center of the conspiracy were now displayed in a new public museum that Marcus had helped design. The exhibit included not just the precious artifacts themselves, but also the story of how they had been stolen and recovered, with special emphasis on the ordinary people who had played crucial roles in ensuring that justice was served. Detective Ramirez, now chief of the anti-corruption unit, had successfully prosecuted dozens of cases involving government officials who had abused their positions. He credited the Rodriguez case with teaching him that the most important part of any investigation was being willing to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of how powerful the people involved might be. Maria Santos had left the public defender's office and started her own practice specializing in wrongful conviction cases. She had successfully exonerated 17 other innocent people, using many of the same techniques and principles she had learned during Marcus's case. She often said that defending Marcus Rodriguez had been the most important case of her career because it had shown her what the justice system could accomplish when it worked the way it was supposed to. On quiet evenings, Judge Vasquez would sometimes sit in her study and look at a photograph that held a place of honor on her desk. It showed her standing between Roberto and Marcus Rodriguez on the courthouse steps the day the charges were dismissed, all three of them smiling despite the tears in their eyes. Next to it was another photo from Marcus's wedding, showing 4 generations of the Rodriguez family celebrating together. These images reminded her of why she had become a judge in the first place, not for the power or prestige, but for the opportunity to ensure that the law served justice rather than just the powerful. The Rodriguez case had tested everything she believed about the legal system, and while it had shown her how close the system could come to failing, it had also demonstrated that when good people refused to give up, truth and justice could still prevail. Marcus Rodriguez continued to receive job offers from private security firms and international organizations, many of which would have paid him far more than his palace position, but he always declined, explaining that his loyalty was to the institution and the people he had sworn to protect, not to the highest bidder. The transformation in Marcus's life had been remarkable, but perhaps even more significant was the impact his case had on the kingdom's understanding of justice and fairness. Schools now taught the Rodriguez case as an example of civic courage, and a national holiday had been established to honor ordinary citizens who stood up for truth and justice. As Marcus stood in his office one evening, looking out at the palace gardens where he had once walked as a simple guard, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. The attempted frame-up that had nearly destroyed his life had ultimately made him stronger, and had given him a platform to help protect others from similar injustices. He thought about Lord Chancellor Williams, now serving his sentence in a maximum security prison, and felt not hatred but sadness for a man who had thrown away a position of trust and respect for temporary gains. Marcus had visited Williams in prison once, not to gloat but to try to understand how someone could fall so far from the ideals they had once claimed to uphold. The greatest legacy of the case, Marcus believed, was not his own vindication, but the changes it had brought about in how the kingdom approached justice and accountability. Young people now grew up with the understanding that courage could come from the most unexpected places, from a construction worker willing to testify truthfully, from a judge willing to stand up to political pressure, from a cleaning woman willing to risk her job to tell the truth. As the sun set over the palace that had been both the scene of his greatest trial and his ultimate triumph, Marcus Rodriguez knew that his story would continue to inspire others for generations to come. The case that had begun with false accusations and ended with vindication had become something much larger, a testament to the power of truth, the importance of courage, and the possibility that justice could still prevail in a world where it was often in short supply. The palace guard, who had once stood accused of betraying, his oath had instead become a symbol of what it meant to serve with honor, integrity, and unwavering commitment to the truth. And in the end, that was a legacy worth more than any crown jewel ever could be.